Welcome to Subject to Change. I'm Ann Hamilton, a visual artist with...
And I'm Johanna Burton. I'm the director of the Wexner Center for the Arts. On this episode, Ann and I will be speaking to a longtime Wexner Center friend and collaborator, dancer, choreographer, and director, Bebe Miller. Bebe, a past Wex Residency Artist, was also a distinguished professor at The Ohio State University from 2000 to 2016. She's been honored with 4 New York Dance and Performance Bessie Awards, the Jameson Archival Advocacy Award, fellowships from the Ohio Arts Council, and the Guggenheim Foundation, is a United States Artist Ford Fellow, and was included in the inaugural class of Doris Duke Foundation Artists. She joins us today to talk about her work, her practice, and process in a time of unprecedented upheaval and change. And we're just really excited to have you here with us, Bebe, so I think we'll just jump right in.
Great. I'm glad to be here.
So, Bebe, I wanted to start by talking to you a little bit about your background in improvisation. I think we're inhabiting a moment of daily improvisation in our personal lives, but I also know from a very young age, before improvisation really became part of the postmodern vocabulary in dance, you were training as a very young performer. And I wonder if you could maybe talk about that background, but also the preparation it may give you for this moment we find ourselves in now.
Mm-hmm. Well, growing up in Brooklyn, my mother had, I guess, a little bit of arthritis trouble. And so she found a dance class for herself. And it was at Henry Street Settlement House, which at the time was the home of the Nikolai Lewis Company. And she took us all. We were little kids. I was 3 or 4. And Murray Lewis was my teacher. And class was fun. It was all about fun and imagining and doing things. And improvisation was a big part of what we did every Saturday. And I think it was not pretending. And maybe that's what is so fascinating for me about it, that I'm not pretending to do anything. I am being and responding and imagining at the same time. And back then, when, it's like empty chocolate box. Okay, I'm an empty chocolate box and I will do that. That was a real one. I remembered that for some reason. And something about inhabiting a way of being, a way of thinking about myself as a form, became really a part of my early training as a dancer. I left a lot of that behind for a long time, and kind of got back into improvising with Dana Wright, who's a good friend back in the early 1980s. And it was finding, and I guess this would be the postmodern version of it, another way of thinking about improvisation in terms of the timing, the energy, the dynamic of movement, really differently than imagining. And so I found like I'd a new tool or another approaching what seemed to be my first language in dance. Also by that time I'd been working with a woman named Nina Wiener, who was one of Twyla Tharp's early company members. Very formal, very technical, which was tricky for me, but a way of kind of establishing an interior monologue of how am I going to approach my weight, my balance, my partners, what is the dancing? And so kind of going from that back into improvisation, I had these really different tools about form and imagination. And then going forward in my own work, I think the reality of being in a studio and just even those first steps forward that plant you into a landscape of how you want to consider movement, the time you're in, your partners, the cultural time, the political time, the physical time. All of that seems determined by those first few steps, which are improvised. I mean, we just begin. And so something about the triangulation of people and sensibilities and thought and action um, became the improvised moment out of which form followed. Mm-hmm. So, and I think it's important to think about, for me anyway, just that the improvising to find a structure for performance, or just even to find a way of directing our attention to a particular kind of patterning of movement or energy or dynamic or relationship. And then from there, you do a different kind of work of like, well, what is repeatable in this moment? What can we come back to? And how do we hone a particular approach over time? So improvisation is again, not the pretending, but it's not demonstrating a way of a kind of thought, but it's just an entry into the possibilities of a lot of activities between people and between personal dynamics, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I think as I listen to you, one of the words that comes to mind for me is this deep structure of responsiveness. And which is, you talked about that distinction between imagining and inhabiting, right? And I think about that responsiveness as being something that you find, but yet you have also been in the process, but you've also been, a choreographer that has directed a group of dancers over time. And I'm curious in what way you take something open like an improvisatory exercise, but then how you actually direct them, or what kind of instruction or questions do you ask in the process when you are working not with your own body, but in response to bodies that you maybe are directing but not actually dancing?
Mm-hmm. I watch a lot, and it was such an interesting transition from being inside of work to then moving into directing and noticing. And as a dancer, it's like, what does it feel like? How do you handle the tricky bits? What's coming next? And even as a dancer choreographer, just the shift between those roles is really slippery. But taking myself out, there was something about a visual picture that I had not really been part of before, or I was in it and now I'm outside of it. So then the whole frame is in front of me, and not only am I looking at the movement itself and all of the kinesthetic information that I'm carrying for that, but I'm placing it in space. I'm placing it one person closer to me and one person further away. If somebody is forgetting what they're doing, or there's an interesting dynamic, their attention wanders, and it's like, is there something about that relationship that I can highlight rather than just the movement itself? So I think gradually there was a much more of a shift into the I don't know, what do you call it? The human? No, it's always human, but something about the relational responsiveness that became the tool. So rather than just saying, let's just improvise, but what are the boundaries? What are the things that I can provide as an interruption or an instigator that then shapes a pattern of behavior? And trying to find the language for those things, I think, is really like where I've been in the last 20 years of just like, what are they doing? How are they doing that? What is their sense of attention to each other? And can I mess with that? Because and if you talk to the dance artists, they have a completely different idea of where they are, but I'm just watching them lose their minds or kind of just get stuck in a moment, and it's fascinating. So for me, then, how do I make that a form? And how do I make that a place that they can enter and re-enter and then see what happens?
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting hearing you speak, because as I was hearing your words, I was thinking about a phrase that always sort of bothered me about dance, which is that people choreograph on a body. And the way in which I think some choreographers, including yourself, have really kind of questioned that idea that there's something that's mapped onto another body, and that there isn't a kind of relationality. And I wonder if you can talk about, and over the years, I think it's been really interesting to see this evolution too, again, from you as the dancer to you as the kind of interlocutor with other dancers. Is there a politics behind that move?
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk about that a little?
Well, and I'm not necessarily the best person to talk to about that, because I feel there is, as much as as we work against any kind of a particular hierarchy, but there is an arrangement of view, and there's an arrangement of presence. And if I am watching and not really feeling the weight exchange or the energy between people, there is an ownership that they have of that moment that I am. They're privy to something. They're privy to something else that I am not,
Yeah.
And at the same time, I'm there saying, "But change what it is that you feel." So there's I'm messing politically, I think, with their intentions of body, of person, of relationship. And over time, I've kind of, I think of the missteps that I've made in that, along those lines of what is it that I'm asking of these people with each other, and do I have the right to do that? Because it makes for a more interesting dance. And so I feel like I've learned to, if not so much kind of suppress that pokey bit, but just to share in the ownership of it, and that and kind of just engender a place of response that everybody's involved.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's not you responding to them, but it's the response between everybody that's in the room.
Well, we talk about what's between us, which is the peace.
Mm-hmm.
What does the peace need? And that's not what do I need or what do they need. It's like what there's a moment here. There's a moment of change that is really just totally ephemeral. And how do we all kind of pay attention to it to take it to the next level? And in identifying that, I feel like there's an ownership that is shared that feels really, well, it's really important to kind of the work that I want to make. I think the choreographing on also kind of implies that there is a neutral body that is receiving, and that's never the case. So, allowing, yeah, but also kind of making room for all of the ways of paying attention that this group of adults bring into a room is pretty fascinating on its own. So how do I just shape a studio that allows that to happen? That's sounding really abstract, but it's really about it's people and who are bringing something of a very particular perspective that only they have into this room, and I'm trying to not only elicit it but make an arrangement of it that carries.
I think in the performing arts, it's really interesting when you have object makers. There's that moment, right, where the artist is not completely, but people understand the object is separate from the artist. And with live and performed arts, people have a harder time. And what you're describing is an object that lives both within the kind of embodied community that it relies on to perform it, but also something that is bigger than the sum of its parts. And so how one thinks about the dance without the dancers is something I've thought a lot about. I was looking back at your piece from 2014, one of your residencies at the Wex, a history, and wondering if, you know, that's a kind of object lesson in how do you look back at your own practice over time. And I wondered a little bit, and we don't have to, you know, go into this too much if it's not of interest to you, but I was thinking, how would you do that same work now? Just and this idea of not just one dance either, but a lifetime, right, of making and thinking about that object and its shifts was quite interesting to me as we were preparing for this. I think everybody's looking back at their life through a particular lens right now.
Well, I'm glad you're bringing up that work. Daryl Jones, Angie Hauser, our dramaturg Talvin Wilkes, and I. It was basically the four of us making this, and it represented, let's see, the third piece between Daryl and Angie, and an opportunity to reflect back for the two of them to reflect back on duets that they had done 10 years before and 5 years before. And I think this was all we'd been talking a lot about, like, what is it, could we make an archive of creative practice, not so much of the pieces, but like, what is it that we carry between us?
Yeah.
How is that shared?
Yeah.
So a lot of conversation, bringing in lots of people, hearing, and then there was one day he said, like, well, let's make something and figure out like what the process is, and then we could write that down and show the piece. So there was a chasing our own tail aspect to it, but there is also, you know, several of these moments where I remember specifically we were on the Mershon stage in rehearsal, and I'm watching the video of Angie and Daryl from 2000 in their making of another piece, and they are trying to remember it, and I'm watching them as well and seeing how they are transposing their roles. They couldn't quite figure out who was who, and there's a once only time of their really re-entering into their creative history together. And so then what do? How do you recreate that moment in a piece that is alive to its time? And I think that there is something that felt really confirmed about how in the best of times, in the best of pieces, the dancers, we're all kind of transformed from the beginning to the end of the piece. And maybe the audience is too, in some sense. So how do you make a form, create a form that allows for that evolving over time, as well as staying true to the sequence of events? So really, can you remember, and in remembering, are you in the present moment, and can you do both of those at the same time, and can you talk about it? And so that piece carried all of that, I think.
You pat your head and rub your belly.
Yeah, kind of, in a good way.
Well, maybe that opens the conversation for you to talk a little bit more about talking. That I know that you have been hosting conversations with other practitioners, with dancers. There's, you know, one way I'm imagining that you try to convey kinesthetic knowledge, which is like, of course, there's this paradox because you have been described as somebody that movement just flows out of. And that is really different than the words we use to describe that thing that flows. And yet I know in what you're even describing in the kind of looking back retrospective piece, how talking about it, asking other people to the conversation. And maybe to focus that question a little bit, I've been wondering, in some ways, how much does the talking influence the actual thing made? And in another way, how much is it the landscape that just allows this thing to emerge, but it doesn't really explain the thing that comes from the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in a way, there are these two different tracks. There is the conversation between us that is taking us forward as a way of noting on a really basic level, even time, the shift of time, or paying attention to each other. Can you do it differently, and how differently did that work? So there's that looking forward, but also the trace you're leaving of a back and forth that is in a different lineup than the piece itself. So I feel like we're making a work. We're also making a way of working, and they're happening in parallel, and they're not always necessarily available to an audience or to each other at the same time. But I feel that one of the things that's just come to me over this last decade or so of really looking at this archival practice is that conversation will continue, and that it is uninterrupted. It takes a different shape, and then a piece is dropped out of it. But the kind of back and forth, and the evolving questions of who are we in these bodies, what do we carry, and in relationship to what, and how the weight of the moment of this particular pandemic moment, for instance, of time and no touch, say, different than a year ago. So what is the weight of all of that exchange in the press of bodies together? Mm-hmm. And when I say press of bodies, I mean, I'm all about weight and touch, but I'm also just really fascinated about the shape of the energy between two sets of hands or across a room, because they speak. It's a compression, and it's a release of both time and energy that we're dealing with. So this ongoing question and discussion, I think, takes different forms depending on who's in the room. And I feel really fortunate that I've had collaborators that I've worked with for 20 years or more to just kind of follow that forward. And at the same time, then when we do bring in someone else and something new, there is a whole nother set of information to just parse and rearrange and accept or reject. So
I have a really kind of almost like a practical question. So you're in a room with students or the dancers you've worked with over time. Is there something that could be described as a process that you set up the condition of that room or the condition of this conversation that allows this thing to emerge that you haven't determined, you don't know yet what it is, and that's, I think different people have really different disciplines around process for generating work. And is that something you could describe?
I will try.
Yeah. Okay.
Because, a lot of it really, that what I'd said before about you go into a room and you put your foot down and all of a sudden there's a direction that you found. I mean, I have lots of ideas before I go into the studio. It's not this blank slate, but there is a determining that has to happen between my own perspective in what I'm trying to marshal and meeting it with a room full of dancers. I mean, working with the students in the dance department is fascinating, because they're living at a different musical time than I am, and a different electrical time, and trying to come to a place where we can communicate about that, and also just to see what are they doing, what is that, why is everybody in one corner today? Mm-hmm. And okay, can we stay there? And what if, oh look, there's a way of following and paying attention that just seemed to kind of emerge. So I don't have that one way, but I feel like what I'm trying to do is just really, really pay attention to what they're doing. One of the things that came out of a process, not with students, although I can't remember if I've used this, if I've then worked with students in this way, but Talvin and I, for another piece, we were having one of those discussions that, you know, they're all working and the dancers are getting a piece of movement off of video. And I just said, you know, can you look how they're paying attention? And there was this really soft, unself-consciousness of this group of 4 or 5 dancers kind of moving in unison because they're following video, but they're not being seen. They are seeing that all of their energy was being into seeing. So there was something about that way of paying attention that just seemed to happen in a room. So I think I do my best to identify how they might be paying attention or what they might be paying attention to, and then shape it, hold it. Do you need a video to do that? Can you do that without a video? Can you do looking sideways? Or do you pay attention? How do you pay attention to the people between you? And offer these as just questions that we can all investigate rather than me telling them this is the important one. So that I know doesn't help me so much. At a certain point, I will need to, and particularly in works with students, we have a particular length of time to create and finish something. So there does come a day like it is this and it is not this other thing. But the description of a way of approaching, and almost the verbal description of a way of approaching an idea about movement becomes really foundational, more so than the shape of the body, the shape of time.
One thing that is of interest to me that you just touched on is I would never say that your work has really been about technology, but it obliquely opens the door to it in various ways, which I find really interesting, particularly given the kind of perceived misfit between the presence of dance, right, and how technology sort of interacts with that. And I know your attention both to that as a mechanism, but also as a mode of archiving is something you've been thinking about a lot lately. Will you just, I don't know, give a little current thinking, particularly now that people, as we are now, this is how we are interacting. But you've thought about it for a while, so I'd love to hear you talk just about the role of technology in your work, or around your work, or near your work.
Right. And luckily we've had 30 years of documentation in some fashion or another, or longer, and with video. And I think there's that, you put on the camera and then you kind of record the thing and you have a document. Right. But you also have a document of the in-between, or those moments of when everybody's going to the camera and they're going to turn it off like this. And then, and they, all pieces start like this. and so can you keep that part? Can you notice something about like in documenting, you are documenting even on the outside of the frame. So just introducing that idea just to myself of all of the rehearsals that we videotape, we've also, just because they're on video, we've audio taped them. So we hear our discussion in and around that. So can I lift that? And what do we see and what do we hear? I did work for a few years with the WOSU group and got really kind of fascinated with using that in-ear feed of conversations that you then are trying on again. And it was a very fairly simple device of just oh, I can hear, and I just match what it is that I'm hearing. So, and something that we do because maybe we are so cinematic these days, and we know about movies, and we know how to inhabit a voice. There's something that is released, I think, when people are allowed to play in that way. Um, but more importantly, I feel that this goes back to, are we imagining a moment? Are we in a moment? Are we demonstrating that we are imagining a moment? Something about the taking in real terms these documented videos, discussions, that they are an alive moment that has been captured in some way, and how to then there's never a way of repeating it, but you just re-inhabit it. And so then what surfaces, knowing that it's never the same thing, that this you are always improvising your way into a captured moment.
Well, it's like with your piece that really was, in some ways, you gave yourself a form for a retrospective, but it was about inhabiting these pieces that were foundational to the development of your vocabulary, but bringing them forward in time. And in doing that, they become a new thing. It became a new piece.
It became a new piece.
Yeah.
For people who maybe had no relationship to what we were referring to. And so and I think some of that was not as successful as it is as I would have liked. And I learned, it's like, if they don't know what you're referring to, how important is that? And I'm interested in what happens when you don't know what I'm referring to, because something else is present at that moment. It's sort of like listening into a conversation as you're passing somebody on the street, and you hear like some real provocative tone, and that's all you get. But you know that they have a history, and you know that they have a future, and so then just that brush of possibility feels really potent and interesting to play with.
Well, you just used the word future, Bebe.
Yeah.
And I think, at this moment where the theaters are pretty much closed and the context for dance is it's suspended or in pause, and I'm curious for you how that affects how you're thinking about what you're making or how you can make. You can't work with other dancers in the same space so easily at the moment, and where that makes you think about all the ways now you have to improvise in a completely new way.
One of the things that's been interesting in these last few months is how, well, interesting to me, I am not in a practice. I'm not warming up every day. I'm not stretching. I go for walks every day with our dog. I garden. I'm cooking a lot. But I'm in my body, thankfully, and there's an attention I feel to texture and scale, and maybe that's one way of thinking of it. It's just visually what it is I'm seeing. Yeah, sunsets, this and that, and gorgeous. I'm outside. I haven't been here for a whole summer ever. So there's that, but there's also an attendance that I'm bringing that is new for me. And so the translation right into the studio, into the next way of developing a work has been delayed. And I don't recognize the same impulses that I normally do. I think there are impulses there that I just am unfamiliar with, which is really enticing. When I think about scale and time, uh, the other day I was videotaping Wilson, our dog, his takeoff in the grass to run to get the frisbee, and it's just like such a consistent like rah, and just trying to frame that in a particular way. And I know that it's useful. I know it's going in there in some way, but um, uh, I don't know what it's going to translate into. Um, we are not going to become Wilson, but there's a movement action that is in its repetition that is inviting to me, and there's a frame around it, and there's this beautiful green lawn in his black hairy butt, that I'm watching. So I think that without the chain of connection between generating and funding and talking to presenters and gathering a cast and just setting out the calendar, without that kind of chain of events, we're really not at a loss, but we're at a gain, perhaps, of an aim, not an aimless wandering, an aimful wandering forward in a direction we just don't know the steps yet. But I think I feel that I'm in touch with the texture and the scale of my day, and it's just taking a different kind of time to read that.
I always feel like something that's so interesting when there's big kind of massive social or political change is that we're reminded, at least through art history, that everything we look at is at the thing itself, but it's also representative of the change around it, which is what you're describing. And that even if you were to perform the same work tomorrow that you performed 6 months ago, it would have different meaning and it would be received differently. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's always struck me about your work and what Anne was getting at before, with the work itself and the language around it, and how they are, they create something additional, kind of supplement. So, and again, as a footnote, I've also appreciated that you haven't put one above the other. I feel like in dance history, people either hang really on to pure embodiment or they hang really on to the conceptualization, and you've sort of said you can't do that, you need both. What's the new frame going to look like, or how? I really like that you're seeing it as a positive moment. I'm trying very hard to do that too. I actually think we are, as a society, able to look very carefully at things right now, and that's painful, and it's also exciting. So as you come out the other side, I think about you as a teacher. How would you teach? And I know you're not teaching in the same way that you were, but how would you talk to your students about making right now?
I'm not teaching. And but I feel like I'm listening a lot, and it is a hopeful moment, because that's what we're left with. I think all of the unrest after Mr. Floyd, and the potential for change that just it was globally felt. And I think and I think actually my students, if I had them, they are really paying attention to what is different now. And because I've spent this last 6 months not being in a studio and still trying to figure out how do I make. So they have lots of stories to tell along those lines. They have lots of practices that they've been involved in. So it might be a question of just kind of, finding the grid pattern of all of those practices over the last 5 months and shifting them and borrowing them and turning them sideways, and so that they are parallels, or they're intersections with all of their compatriots. So I do think we're deep moment of change, and that has to be in a positive direction, because that's the only one we have. So how to just point that out, or allow them to find that on their own, because I think that they are. And I would want to just guide that and hear that the best I can. I love the idea, like, as a choreographer, and I think this is a teacher too, that you get a lot of this, you get the opportunity to be perpendicular to their direction, where they're going, that you can just kind of do these little, those little things that turn spaceships, those bursts of air that reshift a direction of a large traveling culture. So how do you just give enough of a twerk or pulling into the vacuum in front of them, as opposed to just pushing from behind? So I think that there are all of these guidances, and also a reminder that we are not alone in this. I think that's the other gift of this moment, that it is shared widely and painfully between so many people around the globe. So how does that help?
You're like a gentle disruptor. You use the word disruption, but you mean it in that sort of guiding way, which is really...
Well, our friend Ann Carlson, who we all know, I think, said something the other day. We were talking about with others about audiences and our relationship to audiences, and she was saying, like, can we just imagine a benevolent audience? And I loved that. I loved that there was that possibility of just even checking, like, which one am I imagining today, and why not on the side of benevolence for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kindness, tolerance. Yeah.
And being pissed off is not outside of the frame, because there's a lot to be pissed off about. But I mean, ultimately, where do we go? Where do we go with that? And we go toward change. So.
Well, and I think there's a lot of pressure. I think we all feel internally to have a response, to have something to say in that feels tied up like a complete sentence. And I think also what you're describing that is so beautiful is that we are in a listening moment, and we're trying to pay attention to everything that's going on and where we are. And that kind of cultivation of attention is what you've been doing your entire practice.
Thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's a fun ride, I gotta say. The opportunity to pay attention.
It's important. And it's interesting when you've used that phrase a few times. It's one that applies outside of the discipline, right? Mm-hmm. So it's also a model for ways of being outside our own immediate fields that is really interesting as well, I think. And that's something I think that the purpose of some of these talks, we were thinking, how do you talk about this uncertainty with direction? And it is about paying attention. You don't know to what, you don't know where it'll take you. But figuring out how to use that as a forward force. Mm-hmm. Do you imagine, are you, I'm thinking about my, you talked about your dog, I'm thinking about my cat who you can see her dreaming about running, right? Do you imagine, do you dream about dancing? Do you dream about being back in the studio? Is there a phantom limb around it? You just seem actually so, you actually seem fairly kind of rooted in the waiting and in the pause and using that moment. But I can't imagine that you're not, like, there's not muscle memory that wants to be in the studio.
Well, actually, there's yeah. And I'm talking with my longtime collaborators, Angie and Daryl and Lila, our project manager, about a new project that seems to be sort of is it mentoring? Is it it's not teaching? Is it collaborating? Something in between all of these things that we call solo duo dancing. And because it kind of came out an impulse I had to, when I think about all this creative practice I've built up over time, at a certain point, unless it's in use, it doesn't do anyone any good. So is there something to pass on? Is there a form of that? And we came up with a thought that it's a way of paying attention. It's a way, it's relational in its fundamentally, rather than here is the name of a particular score where someone is the hero and someone is the attendant, and this is what you do. Rather, it's like, how are you in the mindset to even notice a score is arriving? And how do you identify what's in the room? And so we were thinking that it'd be wonderful to share that with maybe younger dance artists, choreographers, and performers. But it also would be really interesting to share that with my peers of just what are these forms that we have articulated over time, and whether are they choreographic, are they philosophical, do they go into other kinds of disciplines of where people are working together and trying to create something that was not there before. I mean, scientists do that all the time. So something about the exchange of manner of approach I find really interesting. So it's not the same as being jazzed about being in the studio, but it's being jazzed about being in process, I believe. So.
I'm going to make a plug for the Wex, but I'm also interested to hear you kind of say a little bit about this. You also, I understand through the grapevine, are going to do a kind of solo duo experiment at the Wex soon. Do you want to, and what's interesting about that is, as I understand it, so the Wexner, for those folks who are watching this, has been closed for 6 months. We opened the building yesterday, but only for exhibitions. So people can come see visual art, but we are not yet fully, and we are a four-legged stool. We want all of our areas open, but due to the limits of the pandemic and what we can actually do safely, our performance spaces are not open, but we're starting to consider ways to let artists work in them in these ways where there are either limited audiences or no audience. And as I understand it, you and Paul are going to begin working together a little bit. I don't know if you want to say a word about it, but I'm very excited just to know you'll be there.
Sure. Yeah, I'm excited too. Yeah, Paul Lazar, and we've met a year ago and work with Big Dance Theater. The Road Awaits Us was the name of the piece. And in the performance of that work, Paul also did an excerpt of his piece, Cage Shuffle, which is working with John Cage's stories and dancing to them. It kind of those things that come up. It's like, wasn't that such a great piece? I love how you're doing that. Wouldn't it be fun to do it as a duet? Oh yeah, wouldn't that be? And here we are. So now we are gonna see how we do it as a duet. And I'll start off by learning a lot of the material from Paul. There's an opportunity for me to put in some choreographic shaping here and there. So, and that's going to be performed and recorded at the end of October. So, yeah, looking forward to it.
It's also an example, Bebe, maybe to go back to Johanna's earlier conversation about technology, because my understanding of that piece is that there's a shuffle of audio that's coming that as you don't know what's coming, right? In what you hear. And so how the use of technology makes a condition that makes it live in a way that is very different than if like you knew your lines and you knew what was coming, and maybe not so different than how the camera has worked for you or some of the historic footage in some of the performances.
Yeah, and Paul being Paul has added the twist that these are 1 minute stories of that I haven't really heard yet. I don't know if it's his voice or John's voice or what, but the order of the stories is shuffled, but the dance is not. So you have dance C being done to story Q, one day, and then it's, you know, a whole nother relationship in time the next time you perform it. So I like the rigor of learning all of this so specifically, and then listening and finding your own timing inside of something that is very changeable. That is, it's pretty fascinating just to think of it. And I loved watching him do it. So it's gonna be great.
Good. This has been great.
Yay.
That's been great, Bebe. Thank you so much. And it's inspiring, which is partially selfishly why we wanted to have these conversations with folks like you. So maybe we'll keep continuing on off the screen, hopefully soon. I mean, it's last thing I will say is that even if there's no audience watching you and Paul, it matters somehow that you're in the building doing the work. And I can't quite figure out, what that means, but I'm really, I'm really thankful for it. I think it will help us somehow, even as we're not fully open. So.
Oh, well, that's great. Great. I'm looking forward to it. And thank you both. This was lovely. Yeah. Thanks for the invitation.
And maybe it will find a benevolent audience.
Yeah.
I love that.